Okay, so we were in the hospital for 2 weeks after our twins were born in 2020. I am finally sitting down 6 years later to share my birth story, not to create fear, but to make sure that twin moms who potentially want a vaginal birth are aware of the risks and can advocate for themselves differently than I did. I tried to educate myself as much as possible before the birth of my twins, but there was things that I just didn't know, and I don't think I possibly could have known. So if you're getting ready to give birth to twins and you want to do it vaginally, here are some of the things that I experienced. So hopefully you don't, and you can advocate differently for yourself than I did. So when it came to where we were going to give birth, my husband had trained as a paramedic, and he unfortunately had seen quite a lot of traumatic births, and he was fearful of possible complications and me bleeding out. So we opted for a hospital birth over home birth. I don't know, based on where we were living in the country at the time, if we could have found a center that was open to taking a twin birth, because there are complications that can happen, and the risk of transporting me to a hospital in time was definitely high. And so we opted for the hospital birth. I wasn't excited about it because in hospitals with twin births, they make you give birth in the OR, regardless if you want a vaginal birth or not. I gave birth in 2020, which, as you might know, was the pandemic. I didn't have the greatest of care, but the OB that was following my case, she kept putting the fear of God into me that if I kept waiting and waiting, that I was potentially going to have a stillbirth. So I was told I needed to be inducted well ahead of my due date. I said, I want to go as long as possible. I was able to actually push the induction date to 38 weeks and 5 days. So much later than most twin births opt for. They usually opt for an early C-section. We scheduled our induction day, actually got a coffee, we got ready, had a shower, did my makeup, headed to the hospital, and we were put on I was put on a Pitocin drip to try to induce labor. I labored for about 12 hours that day, and I had maybe one intense contraction. Nothing was happening. So they opted to take the IV out and let me sleep for that night. And then they said they would try again the next day. Okay. So one thing I forgot to tell you was we had arranged for a doula. I really wanted to have someone there at the hospital with us who could help advocate for me, help keep me calm, help with pain management. Unfortunately, the day that we were supposed to be induced, I called my doula on the way to the hospital, and she said that she had another patient go into early labor the day before, so she was still with her. So she never actually came to the hospital. She had a backup doula and sent her instead. I had never met her. So the day that we got induced, in terms of the Pitocin drip, this random lady showed up at the hospital, didn't know her, never met her. And unfortunately, we were not a good match. So that day, I told you, I labored the whole day. Every time I would have a contraction, this doula would make audible breathing noises. Let me see if I can remember correctly. But every time I would take a deep inhale, I'd be like, she would go, ooh, there was some sort of audible noise that she would make every single breath. And I just it was making me angry. I was getting angrier and angrier. Maybe that's why I didn't go into labor the first day, but I was so mad. So when they told me that they were going to let me sleep, we sent her home and we said, we'll see you the next day. And then I told my husband to text her and say, don't come back, because I couldn't do it in purpose. I was exhausted. I just labored the whole day and I was too exhausted to be mean. So we just texted and say, it's not a fit. Please don't come back. So we didn't actually end up having a doula with us the next day, which I slightly regret. I don't think I could have done any more with this lady there. Something that I did as we got to the hospital. So we actually had to call and ask if the L&D ward was busy that day, because they actually probably wouldn't have induced me if it was too busy. So we called and they said, we're not too busy today. You can show up. So we showed up. We actually brought a really big gift basket. I think I put granola bars, fruit, snacks, and candy corn that we had gotten from one of the local candy shops. So we brought that because we know it was going to be a long process. There was going to be lots of care needed for us, and little did we know how much care we would need, but we just wanted to be nice to the nurses. Also, they were in L&D. They were in a hospital during the pandemic with all of these atrocious rules. We simply wanted to make sure that they knew that we were really grateful for them. One of the nurses actually became an angel for me. So it was well worth the gift basket. We wake up the next day, July 29th, the day that I gave birth to the twins, and they start me on the oxytocin or Pitocin drip again. And they actually ended up breaking my water. So they ended up breaking my water probably around noon. I hadn't been fitted for an epidural yet. We were going back and forth. So I didn't want an epidural. The reason why is because if you've watched my channel, you know that I live with MS. When I was diagnosed with MS, the right side of my body went numb and tingling. And I didn't want to ever feel that again. So I was having an issue with the epidural because I didn't want to feel numb. I had a lot of fears around that. I wanted to experience birth. As a twin mom and a first mom, this was probably going to be my only pregnancy. I wanted to experience birth. I wanted to know what it felt like to have a babies pop out of me. And so I really didn't want to lose that sensation. However, I was talked into it because, yet again, they believe in worst case scenario, right? They have seen worst case scenario. And so in case I had to have an emergency C-section, it's better to have the epidural already running. I had been told, or had done a bit of research, that I could have had the epidural sited, but not run. And so in the case of an emergency, they could then run it. But the anesthesiologist didn't feel comfortable not actually running it because they needed to know that it would work, which I can understand. That kind of frustrated me. So I was kind of railroaded into getting the epidural, which was technically necessary based on what happened next. But I really wish I had been a little bit more adamant about not having the epidural. I continued to labor after the epidural was sited and run. I had probably been around like a 6. We didn't actually look at how dilated I was before the epidural. They started the epidural, everything started going numb. I was laboring for a bit. I think Mike left to go call his parents or to go get us food. They did a cervical check and I was already at 10 centimeters. And so I thought that meant that, like, oh my gosh, we're ready to go. We're going to start pushing. And so I immediately text Mike, like, get back up here. It's go time. Meanwhile, I still probably labored for like another hour. So he had time, but I made him rush back in. So they let me labor longer in the birthing suite before we actually went to the OR. Another positive that we had was they let me labor in the L&D bed instead of on an operating table, because they're quite small and they're metal slabs. So it was actually quite nice to be able to stay in the labor and delivery bed. It was wheeled into the OR, and that's when a lot of people started coming in. I'm going to pause there. So if you're a twin mom to be and this is slightly freaking you out, I don't know if you want to watch the rest. So there's a part of me that wants you to know what happens so that you can be aware, but I also don't want to worry you. So if you're quite close and you're already like getting a C-section, then this video isn't for you. This is for you if you are in the mind space to be able to hear about something traumatic and know what you can do for yourself should you ever be in this situation. If you're enjoying this video so far, I would love it if you could hit the like and subscribe button so that we can hang out more. So we head to the OR. We're in the OR, and they start bringing in everyone and their mother. So they had obviously my team, and then they had teams for both of the babies, and then I think they had interns, but they were all lined up in front of my vagina. So I was like, can you guys not stand at the end? Like, go to the sides. I don't want you in my line of sight. This is already like too many people. I was really overwhelmed. And so I asked people to kind of move to the side. I maybe pushed for an hour, and then unfortunately, this is where everything started going downhill. So I was given an episiotomy against my wishes. Both babies were born using forceps, which again, I did not know the risks of a forceps delivery. That has since caused multiple organ prolapse. If you learn anything from this video, please advocate for yourself against the use of forceps, because I truly believe that that is really what caused a lot of pelvic floor damage and created the multiple organ prolapse later on. He used a forceps for each of the babies. So this massive device went into my vagina to pull them out. The episiotomy also created damage to my pelvic floor. Alora, our little girl who was born first, she was placed on my chest and they wiped her down right away. I had in my birth wishes that I didn't want them wiped down right away. She was doing fine. She was already crying. And so I was a little annoyed by that. They could have just placed her on my chest. They then took her away to get weighed. Mike went with her, my husband, because I didn't want the babies ever being alone. So he was instructed that he had to go with Alora. So he went with Alora, and then Rylan was born. So again, forceps delivery to pull him out. And then he was placed on my chest. When Mike came back into the room with Alora in his arms, Rylan's on my chest, he said he saw the OB basically like ripping the placenta out of my body. So he didn't let it be birthed. At this point, I started hemorrhaging, and I don't know if I started hemorrhaging before. I have to go back and read. I do have the notes of the birth. I don't know if I started hemorrhaging before or after the placenta was ripped out. In the process of this happening, the placenta was not removed properly, and I had retained placenta. So I'll come back to that. So Rylan's put on my chest, and then I start basically I think I started shaking violently, but I started hemorrhaging, and so they had to give me medication to stop the hemorrhage. They then take Rylan to another room to get weighed. And so Mike goes with Alora and Rylan. I believe I'm getting stitched up. The episiotomy is getting stitched up, but I am hemorrhaging at this point and I am not doing well. So I'm being given medication to stop the hemorrhaging, which caused an incredible amount of diarrhea, which was quite embarrassing. I felt so embarrassed, but I couldn't stop pooping on the table. So I'm wheeled back to the labor and delivery room and I attempt to start breastfeeding basically right away. I wanted to get colostrum into the babes. And so I have pictures of me looking just at totally out of it. My blood pressure had gotten really low and I was passing quite a lot of clots. And so I tried to breastfeed. It wasn't really working. My milk wasn't coming in. So I asked Mike to take the babies. And then I asked if I could go have a bath or a shower. I was just feeling atrocious because I was pooping myself and they were wiping away the poop. I just felt gross. I think it was a nurse. I think the babies were in the bassinet. I think Mike and a nurse were attempting to help me get up and I passed out. I lost consciousness. What Mike remembers is the nurse pressing the emergency button, having a massive amount of people come running in to basically save my life and waking up, just asking if the babies are okay. I was very disoriented. I didn't know what was going on. To that point, we then found that I was passing a lot of clots. And so the OB came in and tried to manually extract more of the clots. This is where the ripping of the placenta was the issue. And so I had retained placenta, which wasn't discovered for a few days. I think it was 1 or 2 days later. I don't recall correctly, but it definitely wasn't the same day. We had gone to sleep that night. I was in a lot of pain. They were palpating my stomach and I was just in excruciating pain. So it was decided that they were going to give me fentanyl and do a manual extraction to try to get the retained placenta out. So I basically had an OB go full hand all the way in to start scraping out retained placenta. One of the worst experiences of my life. I remember just screaming in pain and crying. Thought I could get through this video without getting emotional. And then we were being monitored. I was receiving blood product and iron infusions because of the hemorrhaging. And I was in still a lot of pain, unusual amount of pain and still passing large clots. So a few days later, they finally decided to do an ultrasound and realized that there's still more retained placenta. So they decided and asked if they could do a DNC to remove the rest of the placenta. So I had to go under for the procedure. My episiotomy scars had actually ripped, so they had to redo them. So I basically had 2 episiotomy repairs done within a short amount of time and the DNC. Unfortunately, all of that contributed to a very damaged pelvic floor, which resulted in a multiple organ prolapse later on. So I was sent home, I think a week later, and I was still passing a lot of clots. So we went back to the ER and they told us to drive. We were in a small town on Vancouver Island. They told us to drive back to the hospital in Nanaimo, which is where we had given birth. So we drove back there with the babes. They're a week old and I had a high white blood cell count. So they readmitted me and I underwent antibiotic treatment. They also gave me medication to contract the uterus to see if it would pass more clots. at that time, they also discovered an AVM. So a uterine AVM, I'm just going to read the word so I don't butcher it, is an arteriovenous malfunction. They saw this on the ultrasound and they said, if we need to go in, they would have to go in and cauterize it, which is just quite dangerous and not something I wanted done to my uterus. And so the other thing was to just see if it would heal. And so I was monitored for 6 weeks postpartum. Thankfully, it healed on its own. That was like one thing my body did to heal on its own. I didn't have to have any further intervention. And now me telling the story, I understand how much trauma my body went through. I was barely able to make any milk. I was able to tandem breastfeed a couple of times, but I ended up just breastfeeding my daughter. My son was given a bottle in the hospital and he just took to it and never really was able to latch back onto the breast very well. So we ended up bottle feeding him. I was also pumping so that he could get breast milk, but all in all, it was a very traumatic experience and not the best postpartum experience. The things that I have learned and would have done differently in hindsight is, one, I would have tried to push the induction date. I would have tried to give birth naturally and gone into labor naturally. I would have not let them give me an episiotomy or forceps delivery. I would have been more adamant to let the placenta birth on its own. So those are the three things. If this is watched by like an OB or an L&D nurse, maybe there's reasons why this happened. I've never actually been able to talk about this with a professional and understand like why the interventions were done at that time or what could have been done so that like it didn't continually get worse. Love to kind of have that conversation. Probably not in the comments. So if you'd like to DM me and we could have a conversation outside of that, that would probably be the better forum. But really what I did want to do with this video is not only share what could happen, but just talk to other twin moms who want to experience this. Not many twin moms opt for the vaginal birth, but if you do, these are the things that you might want to look out for so that they don't happen to you too. To get ready for this video, I looked back at my blog. I'm an OG blogger, and I looked back at my blog and I shared my birth story pretty soon after. I had written this down. So in hindsight, I may question our birth, but I do believe that we had the best birth experience for ourselves and our family. I don't actually think that now. I do believe my life was saved. I do believe that I was well taken care of. I remember very specifically one of those L&D nurses that I said we gave the gift basket to. She came in one day after all of the interventions had stopped. And she looked me right in the eye and she said, "How are you?" Because everybody was asking about the babies. Everyone was checking on the babies, making sure that they were gaining weight, but no one was really asking me how I was. I call her my angel for a very specific reason, because she saw me. She let me be seen, and that meant the world to me. So the other thing in hindsight that I look back on is I do believe I had angelic divine presence saving my life. Everything could have gone much worse, and my husband and my children could be without a mom. So I do believe that my life was saved. I do believe that I was well taken care of, but I do wish that all of the railroading experiences didn't cause my life to need to be saved, if that makes sense. So to the twin moms who have already given birth, and if you had a vaginal delivery and it was also difficult, I see you. Obviously, I would love to give you a hug, and I do hope that you are healing well postpartum. To the twin moms who haven't given birth yet and are hoping for a vaginal delivery, I just hope that you learn something from this so that you know what to advocate for. And if you are opting for a C-section, cool. I hope you heal well after your surgery. So I'd love it if you would subscribe to this. We're going to talk more about twin parenting and just parenting and mom life. So I would love to have you in this little corner of the internet. Thanks for being here. Now go and live well, and I will see you soon.